Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. I'm Lori Wallach, and today we're going to do a special short podcast on tariffs. Tariffs! Tariffs! You're hearing about it in the news, maybe in conversations. What the hell is a tariff, and why does it matter? To start with, a tariff is a charge that gets put on a product when it comes across an international border. So an import gets a tariff. And just to shut down this question of some debate, the person who pays the tariff is what is called the importer of record. That is a technical trade term. That is the entity that is bringing the good officially into the country. That can be, and it usually is, the entity that's choosing to import a good. It could be the seller, though. The one entity it's not is the foreign government. Just to clarify that. Now, let's get into the details. So there has been a roiling policy debate underway about tariffs. And to sort of boil it down, you have Vice President Harris talking about the targeted use of tariffs, targeting certain goods, certain products with tariffs. And then you have former President Trump, who is talking about what are called across-the-board tariffs. That would be putting a tariff charge on every import that comes in. So the question in this debate is basically how you use the tool that is a tariff. And in a certain way, it's a relief that we're having that discussion, because for a long time, tariffs were a tool that was just left up on the shelf. But a tariff is a policy tool, just like a tax or a subsidy or a procurement policy. And with any policy tool, the place you should start is what's your goal? And then you decide what tools you want to use to get to that goal. So if your goal is to rebuild some U.S. manufacturing capacity so that we have some resilience, and people will argue it improves our national security to have access to certain critical goods, which we saw what a catastrophic mess it was to have hollowed out most of our capacity to make things when COVID hit, or when we've seen natural disasters or wars in other countries and suddenly we can't get certain things. You don't need to make everything, but you want to be able to ensure you have supplies of key things: medical goods, food, communications devices, energy sources. You make sure you can make some of it yourself, and then you diversify your import sources. And right now we have way too much reliance on individual countries, a lot of it China, but not exclusively. And we've learned the hard way that's a bad idea. So part of what we have as a goal is basically making some more stuff here and then diversifying where we do import stuff from. What are those sectors where you want to have the certainty you have supply? And one useful place to look is these supply chain reviews that the Biden-Harris administration did just when they were coming in the midst of COVID. What are things we can't do without? They came up with medicine and healthcare stuff, personal protective equipment, communications equipment, future energy sources, food, and then a set of building construction materials, so steel, etc. So if you look at stuff like that, we import way too much from China. The previous administration had a very smart trade representative, and they put on tariffs on a bunch of that stuff from China. They put tariffs on $380 billion worth of stuff from China. And the Biden-Harris administration kept those tariffs. But then this gets to sort of the across the board versus the targeted. What happens next? So the Biden-Harris administration added some new, even bigger tariffs on top of the ones that were in place on China, but just in strategic areas. That's their methodology of targeted tariffs. So they put 100% tariffs on electric vehicles and batteries from China because they want to make sure that we develop that sector here and that also those kinds of goods from other countries have a chance. And they raised tariffs on medical goods that they thought we ought to be making some more of here that have been dumped from China. And they ended a waiver on solar cheating tariffs that the previous administration had basically allowed for big utilities to get away with importing stuff that really would crush any chance of making it here. And so they put up some new tariffs also on solar imports that were coming from Malaysia and Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia that were really Chinese products that were circumventing the trade cheating penalties already imposed on Chinese solar stuff. So those are the new tariffs. But this administration then applied a whole other set of policies and tools aimed at actually generating more manufacturing of goods here. So they set up a system of subsidies for manufacturing for companies that would invest in new factories here. And they set up tax credits for consumers to try and generate demand for the American made stuff. And they did those kind of tax things on both sides of the formula for battery plants, EV assembly plants, heat pump manufacturing, solar manufacturing. And then they did a big infrastructure funding package to create a lot of the infrastructure with government money invested for those kinds of transitions to green energy and EVs. And they did all of this stuff, some of it in 2021. That was the infrastructure and the economic rescue bill. Some of it through a thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is in 2022, and the CHIPS Act, which created the same kind of dynamic of tax benefits for companies that would create new microchip plants in the US. And all of that stuff was sort of the offense. People call that package of tools industrial policy. And it was paired with the defense of the tariffs. And the idea of the defensive, targeted, even bigger tariffs was to make sure that you would have a chance to have your domestic production have a demand without all the demand being taken by the unfairly imported, cheating, subsidized stuff, and to make sure you could start importing from some other countries so that other countries could make production and you'd be diversifying your imports. So it's interesting how that's worked out. We saw that during the previous administration, you had the high tariffs on the Chinese goods, and that started to bring down the Chinese trade deficit. But you didn't really get new manufacturing investment here. You didn't really get a big shift in manufacturing jobs. It was kind of headed in the right direction, but it wasn't a big change. Now, interestingly, it almost aligned with when those four big industrial policy bills were enacted by this administration. You start to see these big jumps in investment in new manufacturing. So in 2023, we have the highest rate of investment in US manufacturing construction, making new factories, that we have had in 30 years. It is a pretty stunning shift. And interestingly, we have 150,000 more manufacturing jobs in America than we did at any time during the Trump administration, including before COVID shut everything down. So it looks a little bit like the 1-2 punch of defensive tariffs and then the other set of tools, the investments, the tax credits, the procurement stuff, their incentives for government procuring the products made through these investments. That seems to be starting to deliver the outcomes of being able to make more stuff here, having more resilience, creating more manufacturing jobs, which then gets us back to sort of the other version. So that's the sort of targeted tariffs thing where it's part of a package of tools and you really tariff the living daylights out of the stuff where you want to preserve those goods as things you're going to make and you're going to diversify your imports. The other way is across the board tariffs. That is what former President Trump has talked about doing. And he's talked about 10%, 20% on everything, and then maybe 60% on everything from China. And now I just want to say there's not a great amount of data about how this would work. The theory is you put these tariffs across the board and it effectively forces a shift in your trade balance. So we have a huge honking trade deficit. Now, interestingly, it's smaller than it's been in a lot of years, but still as a percentage of our overall economy, it's just not sustainable. And by the way, this is not a Trump thing or a Biden-Harris thing. This sadly has been true for the last 30 years. We've had a horrible trade deficit and it's systematic. It's not just we had a fluky year or two. So if you want to try to get in that balance, one thing you do is you put a surcharge on all the imports, and that's the across the board tariff. Now, the hitch with it is you're tariffing everything, including things like coffee or bananas or pineapples that we don't commercially grow here. So we're going to have to import that stuff. And nobody knows exactly over the long term how this would work because no one's ever done it for the long term. We do have the example in 1971, the last time there was an across the board surcharge tariff. Then President Nixon did it. We were in a period of very high inflation and we had high unemployment and we were in a real economic crisis. And a big part of that problem was we were getting flooded with imports that were unfairly priced because Germany and some other countries' currencies were devalued. They were lower than what they should have been, which means their imports are basically unfairly cheap, and our exports to them become too expensive to sell. So the US had been arguing with their different trade partners. No one was paying attention, and things were getting more and more dire. And people might remember reading about the Nixon shock. Well, this was part of the Nixon shock. What they did is they put up 10% across the board tariffs. It was kind of like a big old 2x4 upside the head to all the other countries, which was, yo, we're not joking. This is going to have to get fixed. Your stuff can't come in. And that seemed to have put the fear of God into a sufficient number of countries that they negotiated eventually is the shift off the gold standard. The currencies were adjusted to make it more fair. Our trade balance improved. And after 4 months, the across the board tariffs were removed by Nixon because they'd basically been used for the 2x4 purposes and in an emergency. We don't know what would happen over a longer time if tariffs like that were put in. But I would say one thing that likely would happen more with the across the board tariffs than with the targeted tariffs is it could affect consumer prices. So hopefully it's been helpful to unpack what the deal is with tariffs, who's talking about them, what the different theories of them are, how you use them. I want to just close by debunking 2 tariff myths. And this kind of relates to where I was going with prices. So one tariff myth is that tariffs always increase consumer prices. And that's simply not true. And then the second tariff myth is basically tariffs are a really bad idea to use, bad tool. There's something just downright rotten about them. There are other ways you should go about fixing your trade problems. So on the second one first, just to make clear to everyone, anyone who tells you they're for strong trade enforcement, i.e. to counter cheating, dumping or against subsidies, or sanctioning against violations of labor standards, or dumping on the environment, what they're calling for, ladies and gentlemen, is tariffs. So the folks who say, without realizing that this is ridiculous, I'm for strong trade enforcement, but I oppose tariffs, these things are not compatible. So a tariff is the tool you use unless you want to have an embargo. But if you're not banning and you're trying to counter the cheating value of something being priced too low, the thing you use is a tariff. If you're trying to convince a country to stop busting unions, you say, we're going to put a tariff on your damn good until you have labor rights in your country, and then it can be sold here again. You make it too expensive for them to sell it. So that is this myth about tariffs. In fact, tariffs are the tool to make sure that the trade cheating that could destroy your other policies, you can invest and make beautiful new plans. But if all of the demand is going to be filled by trade cheating imports, you've done nothing. Second thing is this price business. So just for everyone to understand, tariffs are charged on the wholesale value. That is the value when the thing comes into the port from the manufacturer and is sent, say, to a retailer. When Walmart decides it's going to buy imported stuff instead of buy from a US producer, and they import the stuff, the price that Walmart is charged is different than the price Walmart charges you. And that's the difference between the wholesale and the retail price. The tariff is charged on the wholesale price. So let me give you an example of what this means. Because sometimes, if there's a big profit margin, the tariff isn't passed to the consumer at all. Or if the good is something that's price sensitive and the retailer wants to keep their market share, the tariff isn't passed through at all. So consider like those $200 pair of Nikes you see. The price of those when they come into the country from Vietnam or China, it's like $20. Literally, it's that big of a markup. And they know they can charge $200. They don't charge $220 because their research shows that will make less people buy them. But they know they can maximize their profits. Then most people will buy $200 Nikes to make it worth their while. So the price, the retail price of many things is not actually associated with the wholesale price. So let's just say there was even a 50% tariff on those Nikes. That does not mean that there's going to be $300 Nikes. No, that means that when it comes in at 20 bucks, the importer who's going to sell it would pay 10 extra bucks. So now it's cost them $30 to bring in the shoes they're going to sell for $200 versus $20 to bring in the shoes they're going to sell for $200. Given you've got a lot of retail markup and profit, that difference is just absorbed. And that's exactly what studies have shown happened with almost everything that got hit by those tariffs I'd mentioned on China from the previous administration. Prices did not jump when Trump put those China tariffs up. Rather, the big study about it shows that importers of Chinese-made goods absorbed most of the tariff and just took it out of their profits. Particularly if you can substitute goods. So even if you decide, all right, I'm not going to make my stuff in China anymore, I am going to absorb it for 18 months until I can shift my manufacturing to someplace else, back to the US, to Mexico, whatever. And then you have basically avoided that tariff. That's what you want a tariff to do. That's the point of the tariff. You're basically signaling into the wholesale market, take it someplace else or pay a penalty because that stuff is cheating. But whether you pay it as a consumer is a totally different story. So the other thing to understand, though, is it's the substitution, the ability to say, like, okay, I'm not going to make it in that country that has the tariff, or I'm not going to buy from a source that's going to be more expensive. The one hitch with across the board tariffs is you can't substitute if everything is tariffed. Now, I guess you could argue, all right, 60% tariff on China, I'm going to have the import from Mexico that's 10 to 20%. But either way, that's more likely to raise prices than the use of targeted tariffs where you can have imports from another country. So hopefully this has been helpful in clarifying what's a targeted tariff, what's an across-the-board tariff, who pays for the tariffs, what do tariffs mean for prices. If you want to know more or you want a review, may I please recommend you go to our website, www.rethinktrade.org, and right on the front landing page is an accessible document called Unpacking the Rhetoric and Myths About Tariffs. It's more or less the things I've been talking about, but it's got footnotes. So if you want a review if some part of this didn't make sense, or you want to dig into actually reading some of these studies I've mentioned or making sure I'm telling the truth, please go to our website, www.rethinktrade, and take a look. Overall, I hope this short update is helpful. And until next time, signing off from Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.